Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to 15 with Fosca, the podcast. I am truly delighted to have as my guest today Professor Joseph Luzzi, who is the Asher B. Edelman Professor of Literature at Bard College. He is also an award-winning scholar of Italian culture. Professor Luzzi is the author of several remarkable books, including My Two Italies, In a Dark Wood, and Botticelli's Secret. His latest book, which is brilliant, and I recommend it to everybody that I can, is called The Innocents of Florence. And I find it a fascinating book because while it's about the Ospedale degli Innocenti, I find it's very, very relevant to many questions that we grapple with today as well. And I am delighted that you have accepted my invitation to come on the podcast. And I can't wait to talk to you about the new book, The Current State and Future of the Humanities, which is one of my obsessions, and also what you're currently working on and what's next for you. Welcome, Professor Luzzi.
Thank you so much. It's such a thrill and honor to be here. Just chatting earlier, we've had such a common trajectory through Italian studies and common love for Florence. So, what a great place to be. Thank you.
I'm so glad you're here. So let's start with your journey. First of all, you're incredibly prolific and you're very active. I don't even know when you sleep because I'm on your mailing list and I get emails all the time about so many of the wonderful things you're doing. So I want to start by talking a little bit about your journey. So what first drew you to the humanities, and how has your path led you from academic study into broader cultural conversations, if you will?
So, I would say, in a way, my fate was sealed decades ago when I first came to Florence. I was an undergraduate. I hadn't been to Italy before. So the trip to Florence I was so looking forward to it. It was, it was like a dream to be able to go spend a year abroad studying in Florence. Interestingly enough, I grew up in an Italian family. So when I say it wasn't really Italian American because my parents were born in Italy and my older siblings were born in Italy. I was born in the United States. I was the first child of my family born in the US. But I grew up in a home where the Calabrian dialect was spoken, where all the Italian customs were observed. My parents had immigrated to the United States when they were adults and with 4 children. So, you know, though I hadn't been to Italy, I had been living with it growing up. And yet, when I got to Florence, it was very different from my parents' world because my parents were from the South. They fled poverty. They led very difficult lives in Italy. They loved it and they were very attached to it. But Florence was a kind of different experience, that world of high culture that my parents didn't have access to. And I didn't know it at the time, but something happened. It's not like I got there and I was suddenly like, okay, I'm going to go up and grow up and write books about Italy and teach the Italian Renaissance. That wasn't the case at all. But something clearly clicked because I ended up years later, after taking time off, after working after graduation, I decided to go back and get my PhD in Italian literature. And here I am years later, professor of literature with a specialty in Italian culture and a kind of abiding love for Florence. I've written a couple books about topics related to Florence. And it's been a kind of lodestone for me, personally and professionally. Yeah.
Yeah, our stories have some striking similarities, and I always talk about the fact that when I got to Florence, also as a student, I had been like when I was a child, I had been another time, but there's something that just like something magical happened, right? And it became my home. So a little different from your path, but still similar. I was going to wait to talk about the Innocents of Florence, but I feel like we need to just dive right in because I've heard interviews, I've read the book, and you have this like incredible moment, this sort of mystical moment when you're at the Ospedale degli Innocenti, which you've been to thousands of times, you've passed by, you know it, you're a scholar, you're a connoisseur of Florence, but you have this incredible moment, um, and you're inspired to write this book. Can we talk a little bit about that moment and also sort of how the book then took shape for you?
Sure. When I started writing more popular books years ago, an editor once said to me, only write books that are necessary and a book that you feel you have to write. And, I firmly believe that. And I even would go a step further and say, I think the books that we need to write find us and
Mm.
that they kind of become a necessity. They work their way into our world, and that's what happened with this last book, The Innocents of Florence. Never in a million years would have thought I would have written this book. But there, as you said, I'd walked by the building hundreds, thousands of times. It was always kind of ambient. I knew
Mhm.
it was beautiful. I love that square, Santissima Annunziata, which just feels so cosseted and womb-like within this busy beehive of a city. And then one day I was there after lunch with a friend, an art historian friend, and I just felt all these lives of these rescued children. And as I wrote in the book, I could feel them kind of surging through me like an electric current. And I think what happened is that I realized that personally I had produced an innocent years ago, and that I wrote a book about In a Dark Wood, what Dante taught me about grief, healing, and the mysteries of love. How my late wife Catherine had a fatal car accident, and then 45 minutes before she died, she gave birth to our daughter Isabel, who survived miraculously and who's now 18. And those early years, as I was grieving, I needed a lot of help raising my daughter. And, my late mom jumped in
Yeah.
and sort of became a caregiver of last resort. And that's what
Mm.
the children of the Innocenti had. They had a caregiver of last resort who gave them unconditional support when they desperately needed it. They became figli di Firenze, children of Florence. So that connection, I think, gave me the entry point into the book. And at that point, I just felt I had to write it. And it was a completely new book for me. I mean, it was the most historical book I've ever written. I kind of learned the previous book, they say fools rush in where angels dare to tread. So,
Yeah.
I wrote a book on art history, and I had never written an art historical book when I wrote my book on Botticelli. And this book was really a history book of this one institution. And I had to learn how to, and I thank my editor at Norton, Elaine Mason, for this, make the transition from writing like a coffee table book, a kind of history of an institution that you see in museum gift shops, to writing something that's really, you know, critical when it needs to be critical, assigning praise when it's worthy, and just telling a story about a building, the good, the bad, the beautiful, the ugly, and how it changed our understanding of childhood. But the seed for it was realizing that I personally had this been in a situation unexpectedly where I needed that kind of unconditional care that this orphanage offered to hundreds of thousands of children. I mean, it's an incredible story. We live in a world with so much bad news, with so many difficult things happening. I see it all the time in the classroom. My students kind of feel weighed down by the relentless news cycle. And wow, and then suddenly you have a story of a place that is like a humanitarian achievement that cared for 400,000 children over 500 years. It felt like the right time for a book like that. And I'm so glad I did it. Every book, brings its challenges. Every book brings its gifts. This one was this one was a profound personal experience that I had never expected would happen. So, and it kind of, some books take forever. Some books, gestate for a decade. They take 2 decades to write. Like my Two Italies, I'd started writing it kind of in the 90s, and it didn't appear until the 2014. But this one was a intense, concentrated experience where it was written in a circumscribed amount of time, based on that inspiration, that moment that I had a couple years ago. Yeah.
First, I want to thank you for sharing your story, which is an incredible one. And the minute I read the first pages of the book, I was very moved, and I continue to be moved by what you're saying right now. And it comes through in the book, not only the rigor of your scholarship, but I mean, this is a book written by a father and a son, and it's a beautiful tribute to family, to children who, I think, you bring up a really good point. I have like a million things to respond to, but I'll just start with, you talk about your students at Bard and how weighed down they are. We're talking about the innocents. They're still, children in our current modern definition of it, right?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of what comes out in the book, in addition to the fact that I don't think a lot of people do know the story, and I do think a lot of people, especially visitors to Florence, do not go into the
Yeah.
Innocenti, which is a
No.
shame. It is a crime, because not only is it an incredibly impressive architectural and artistic structure, but it holds a lot of those Renaissance ideals, although there's also an underbelly, but there always is, as we know,
Yeah.
there's always an underbelly, but it holds so much, that so many things that are really a key to understanding not only Renaissance Florence, but I would actually say many things that we think about childhood even today, right?
Absolutely. I mean, the response to the book was really satisfying in the sense that right away, a piece came out in the New Yorker the day it was published, basically, or right around the day, about how the resonance of the book today, because of what children are facing today.
Yeah.
Thousands of children are abandoned in America every year. There's something called a baby box that is, there's hundreds of them in the United States, where you can anonymously leave a child. And these are, you can imagine, the subject of incredibly divisive debate, because on the one hand, some people support them as the last chance to protect a child that might otherwise be harmed. On the other hand, there are those who say, well, it creates moral hazard. It makes it too easy to abandon a child and walk away. So these are, unfortunately, the debates about the most vulnerable in society, unprotected children, are alive and well today. In my book, I wish it was just a Renaissance problem and not a modern one, but it certainly is a modern one. The other thing, what you said about this, the innocents, it's so true, because if you go to Florence, you'll see the lines snaking for a mile outside the Uffizi or in the Academia, and you're inside, and it's really hard to have an experience because there's so many people there. Whereas the Hospital of the Innocents is pretty empty, and
Yeah.
it's an amazing museum. It's beautifully put together, and it tells a story. It's curated to tell a story about this evolution of childhood from the 1400s to the 2000s in a really articulate and honest way. Both the triumphs of this Hospital of the Innocents, but also its shortcomings. And so I urge all visitors to Florence and it has a world-class art collection, which is part of my book. That I always tell when I give a talk, I say, okay, let's imagine that you are unfortunate enough to be parentless today. You can imagine all the strikes you have against you, to be an orphan or to be abandoned. Do you think that today you're going to be put into a building that was designed by Brunelleschi with like 9 perfect semicircular arches, beautiful collection of art in a courtyard? No, it wasn't paradise. It was hard for these children. The boys learned a trade. If they were lucky, the girls were married off if they could cobble together a dowry for them. They often had to work as servants. They often had to come back as nuns if they couldn't get placed with a new family. So it wasn't like a ticket to an easy life. But just imagine like creating an orphanage today with art by Brunelleschi and Ghirlandaio. It boggles when I put it like that. You could see the eyes in the audience go, "Wow, that's kind of astonishing that they would
Right.
make this place an orphanage."
Uh-huh.
And that is, I think, a test that's such a Renaissance gesture because it's this belief in the healing power of art and the sort of as I you cross that threshold of Brunelleschi's arches and you leave a world of chaos and difficulty and privation, and you enter into a world of harmonious thought, beauty, proportion, symmetry. It had a psychological effect. I'm convinced of that on these children.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And even though we know that as in every story or in history there's always a dark side, there were thousands of abandoned children who were welcomed
Yes.
into space. They would have, I mean, what fate was there? They would have died. And
Yeah.
you give incredible examples throughout the book that speak to the ideals of Renaissance Florence and how those obviously were a big part of why the Istituto, why the Ospedale was founded in the first place. But I think your conversation, your discourse on beauty is so fundamental because these are people who babies, innocents, right? The Innocenti, they have nothing, right?
Right.
But you give them beauty, you give them the chance of having a life, something of a life, right? Some became even renowned figures, right?
Yes.
You mentioned that there are still people you meet in Florence today, in addition to the fact that, last names are always a giveaway. Because if your last name is, Innocenti or other names that were given to these foundlings, that means that your family was originally,
Yes.
you descend from one of these foundlings, but you still can meet people in Florence today that were taken into the Innocenti. I remember when I first got here, I mean, let's say like in the late 90s, early 2000s, it was still functioning as a space,
Yes.
um, like a foster care kind of situation, but also it was referred to as a proper, let's use the word orphanage, which I know is sort of a problematic term. But I think, how can you speak a little more to sort of the how it was established and what the reasoning was behind it when it was founded in the 1400s?
So what happened is, as you can imagine, in Renaissance Italy, you have the Bible saying, "Be fruitful and multiply." All right. So if you're a family, it's not like there's any church-sanctioned form of birth control or modern medicine and things of that nature. So these children, rich and poor family alike, were having children. The rich families could afford to keep them. Many of the poor families couldn't. And so childhood abandonment was a public health crisis. It was, children were left on the steps of churches. They were sometimes flung onto garbage heaps. They were exposed to the elements. Sometimes they were trafficked. It was a real public health crisis. So you had two institutions that in the past had absorbed some of this problem. You had hospitals, and remember, it's called the Hospital of the Innocents. So, say Santa Maria Nuova would have a branch that would help with abandoned children in churches as well, religious institutions, but you didn't have a state sanctioned one. You didn't have a civic organization. The Innocenti becomes the first standalone civic organization dedicated to the rescuing of children. And it's so bound up in this humanist moment where the Florentines feel that to be a great citizen, you have to work for the greater good of the city. You have to do justice to this Roman heritage, ancient Roman heritage that the Florentines felt, that there's this civic pride, that same civic pride that wanted beautiful art everywhere, that
Yeah.
wanted, as you know, the medieval city and the Renaissance city are so different. The medieval city is towers everywhere, little streets. The Renaissance opens up the piazzas. It starts to create public art everywhere. The wealthy families compete with one another to commission works. The Innocenti was part of this sort of humanist moment of beautifying the city and creating public organizations with all the wealth coming into Florence. And yet, the founder it's an incredible story because it was basically created by one man, name of Dattini, the merchant of Prato, as we call him,
Right.
who was in many ways very problematic as a human being. He was a terrible husband. He cheated on his wife. He had illegitimate children with a servant, with a slave. He was very wealthy, incredibly good businessman. And like many of these super wealthy Florentines, and he was from Prato, Tuscans, he started to worry about his soul when he died.
I'll bet he did. Yeah.
And so he was convinced by his spiritual advisor, Mazzei, that though he had no children out of wedlock with his long-suffering wife, he could take care of these unwanted children of Florence. And he did. He gave 1,000 florins to establish the Innocenti. And he actually had a genuine change of heart in his life. He took into his home a child that he had with a slave. He and his wife raised her, and even took in the mom. So it was the who had in the old days they would have been cast to the streets. So it was a really dramatic story about its founding, and it took its first child in 1445, and for the next almost 6 centuries would go on, 5, 6 centuries would go on to care for hundreds of thousands of children. So think of it as sort of growing out of. There was a wonderful scholar, late scholar from Yale, John Boswell, who wrote a book about abandoned children, and he has a line in his book. He says that same energy that I'm paraphrasing, but he basically says that same energy that went into creating the art and literature in the Italian city-states went into the idea of reconceptualizing the idea of childhood and rescuing these poor abandoned infants. And it's true because in the Renaissance you get a whole interest in the family. Leon Battista Alberti writes his books on the family. Francesco Barbaro. There's other thinkers that are really reconceptualizing what it means. In the Middle Ages, it was more like a child was an imperfect adult, and you can see it in those. If you look at a medieval painting by Duccio or one of these
Right.
12th century, 13th century masters, the baby Jesus looks like an older person who shrunk.
Yeah. Yeah.
Doesn't look like a baby,
Right.
because that was the feeling, as that these are adults in the making. But in the Renaissance there's a real investment in understanding the phase of childhood. Yeah.
And this is why, as we were talking about at the beginning of the podcast, why this book is so necessary. I would also say that I think it's like right now in the moment that we're living in, it feels more necessary than ever to also look back to examples like this, to the notion of such civic pride that we must take care of our children, but we must take care, especially those who have no power. That's probably not really changed in terms of the way that the definition of childhood has certainly changed. But the one thing that has not changed is that the children are still right innocent, right? They're
Right.
powerless, and so it's our responsibility, as I would say, as a society, to ensure right that they have the access, right, that a place like the Innocenti gave them, again, 600 years ago. So looking at that again and the ideals of Renaissance Florence as something that we can still very much learn from today. Um,
Yes.
right? The notion also of the community stepping up, and philanthropists, private donors, Datini. I don't think many people know that story, but yeah, okay, he stood up to save his soul, but he stood up, right?
Yes.
I think a
Yes.
lot more if we could compare him to like what we see in today's society in terms of those who have the money and the power. I don't see too many of them stepping up to save children or ensure that children are surrounded by beauty and possibility, because I think that's also what it comes down to. It's so humanizing, right? It's so
Yes.
humanizing what was going on there.
No question. I mean, to me, the lesson of the book was anyone can be nice or accommodating to someone with money and power because it's in your best interest to do so.
Sure.
But how do you treat the most vulnerable members of society? The word orphanage, it's become what we mean by a place like the Innocenti. It's a shorthand for a place where that takes care of children that other people can't take care of. But technically, an orphan is someone without parents. A lot of the children in the Innocenti had parents. They just
Yeah.
couldn't look after them. There's that heartbreaking image of the mother dropping off the child at the Innocenti and breaking a coin in two, keeping half and leaving half with the child and hope that one day they'd be reunited and put the coin together. Now, most often it didn't happen because if you were in bad enough straits to have to drop the child off, upward mobility was difficult back then. You most usually you just didn't have the chance to reconstitute the family. But if you think of today, I mean, with growing discrepancies in wealth between the haves and the have-nots, between the rising cost of education, all these issues, I do think we have a situation where that question of how do we look after the most vulnerable, how do we look after the poorly resourced, becomes so essential. And for the Florentines, it wasn't just it was a practical issue because there were children in the streets. I think
Yeah.
one scholar said something like half the cities of these Italians. It wasn't just Florence, by the way; it was all the Italian city states. Over half the population were children, many of them unwanted. But it also became a kind of philosophical and cultural issue. And I think that some of the best minds put their minds to thinking through. And it would be wonderful if in today's society, we also, put that level of investment into how do we help those who need the most help. Now, that being said, in Florence, in the Innocenti, um, it was hard for the institution because it's one thing to found an institution. There's a kind of glamour in that. It's like today, people get their names on the building, they get associated with, and that generous philanthropy is important. It's harder to get people to pay for keeping the lights on and painting the
Yeah.
building and
Yeah.
providing the food. The Innocenti had the same problem. It was founded, there was this glorious rhetoric surrounding it. And then for the next centuries, it was always struggling to stay afloat financially. Its initial patrons were the silk weavers, this wealthy guild in Florence. Then it became the Medici family, and they were always sort of begging for money and always kind of the last on the list because Florence had to fund its wars, its more sort of politically pressing issues, and this charity was kind of often left begging for crumbs, and it faced some serious financial challenges throughout its life, which led to overcrowding and sometimes terrible results health-wise, where mortality rates inside the Innocenti at times were worse for children than it was outside, especially if there was a kind of contagion at work. Yeah.
Yeah. Again, not so different from a lot of what we see today, right? Um, I want to stay with the book just 1 minute longer
Sure.
before we pivot to a more general conversation about all your wonderful contributions to the humanities. What do you hope people take away from this book?
I guess my what I hope people take away from this book is related to my work in the humanities, in that too often we think of the art, the humanities, as luxuries, as something that's kind of, if there's money left over, if there's if there's space in the budget, then we can put some money into the humanities, put some energy into it. And think of what people are studying today, the shrinking purchase of the humanities, as people understandably have anxiety about their future employment and want to study business and things that seem more practical, at least on the surface. For the Hospital of the Innocents, yes, they showed that your judge, the ultimate indicator of a society, is how you treat the people that are most vulnerable. That's the most important thing. And I think we should think about that. I don't, want to make too moral of a point, but one thing I always try to do is, how do you treat people who have not had some of the privileges that other people have had? That How do you kind of treat people that need a hand up? Right. That's the main message. Need help. That's the main message of the book. A corollary to that is, art, literature, the humanities are essential to a functioning society. It was essential to the Innocenti. It distinguished it from all the other orphanages that were trying to keep these kids alive. This one was also trying to educate them. This one was also trying to introduce them to a sense of beauty. This one, and by doing so, really um, respected the dignity of these orphans. You
Yeah.
know, for me, this book was an eye opener in that I knew Renaissance Florence. I spent much of my life teaching and writing about its glories. I knew there was slavery, I knew there were poverty, but boy, was this book an immersion in the dark side of the Renaissance.
Yeah.
There were
Yeah.
so many slaves in Renaissance Florence. There was so much sexual violence against young
Mhm.
girls. At one point, the Innocenti didn't want to send its young girls to noble houses because they just assumed there would be episodes of sexual violence against them. And too often they were right. As I wrote in my book, the most glittering names in the Florentine aristocracy would be having children with slaves.
Yeah.
The father didn't want anything to do with the child because it was an inconvenience, an embarrassment. For the wife, it was a humiliation of her husband's infidelity. So they were often left to die in the streets if the Innocenti didn't take them in. So you have not only protecting those people, but you're collecting art by Ghirlandaio, Piero di Cosimo, the Della Robbias. You're exposing them to breathtaking art. I hope that people see that, these works of the imagination and creativity are just as essential as uh, like like food and water.
Yeah.
You got to have food and water first. I get it, but this was in the DNA of the Innocenti, the power of art and the humanities to enhance and dignify these abandoned lives.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And also, you use both words, dignity and dignify. And I think that's really at the heart of the matter. And I want to get to a more broad conversation about the humanities. I've been reading lately that actually humanities majors and the liberal arts education is becoming more appealing in our
Mhm.
AI age, right? And I'm
Yeah.
so happy when I read things like this because, yeah, I've dedicated my life to the humanities, and I'm a strong believer that the humanities um, form you in a way that few other disciplines do. And I recently read an article, which has been circulating, you probably saw it as well, about how AI companies, for example, are very interested in humanities majors because, well, of their humanity. Um, if we want to go back to sort of, this notion of caring and emotional intelligence, whatever, but also more, other things like critical thinking, being able to speak eloquently, being able to write intelligibly and well. So, as somebody who has dedicated his life to the teaching and the study of the humanities, why are the humanities still so important to study today and not something that should be looked at as, oh, a fluffy major or, something that you do just when you have a little, leftover money in
Yeah.
the budget? Why should you tell why should a parent tell their child to study the humanities today?
I mean, if you think about it, I think the big question is the crisis we have as a society. We'll just take the American perspective because I'm
Of
in,
course.
in American higher education. What should an education do? Okay, the model maybe used to be when only elites went to school who didn't really have to worry about future employment. They were like, okay, I want to learn stuff, and there'll be a job waiting for me because my dad is such and such, or my mom is so and so. When education is thankfully democratized, and people from all different classes go, as the job market becomes more competitive, there's this anxiety about, okay, and as costs rise, I mean, education in the United States is extraordinarily expensive. There's an understandable anxiety about, well, this should be a kind of training for a job. This should sort of promise me something. And so we've seen a shift, a dramatic shift from, say, 50 years ago, where, liberal arts schools were always a little bit we're always in the minority. People have to understand that this idea of everyone studying the liberal arts it's just not true. But certainly within the context of people went to liberal arts schools, people would study history, English, sociology, then go on to get a job and work in banking or go to become teachers or go to medical school. Now they're studying directly. A lot of them are studying business, accounting, and a lot of these more sort of professional training degrees. And you can understand because there's a sense, well, if it costs so much money, there's got to be a return on my investment. I
The
got to help my
investment.
child get ahead. But where I think that's short-sighted is that a lot of the stuff that people are studying as undergrads, people used to learn on the job. And at the same time, they had that history degree, which would enable them to look more broadly about where the company fits and where the company's going in international trends. They would have that literature degree, which taught them how to read closely and think critically. And so I really do believe that there's a value add in a liberal arts education that transcends technical training. That, and if
Mhm.
you look at some of the top jobs, people in the top positions, many of them have that liberal arts degree.
Yeah.
And it teaches them how to think critically, how to think comparatively, how to put things in context, all those tools that a great liberal arts education gives you. I think this is so extraordinary because we're living in an age soon enough where machines can do the quantitative stuff much better than humans, whether it's math related or analytical. So I don't have a crystal ball, but my hope is that there's going to be more of a need for the kind of qualitative assessment based tools that a liberal arts education gives people and then the machines can do the heavy lifting of
Yeah.
the computation and whatnot. Of course, we're going to need people who can do math and engineering and science, but I would not count out the value of a liberal arts education. I even see it in my own world, how there's such a hunger for students to learn about things that they can't get from their iPhone or their computer or their social media. This is where this is an amazing opportunity for liberal arts places to double down on these qualitative skills and these um, skill set for broader thinking that it will allow students to contextualize individual problems and connect the dots. I mean, I've been teaching now for decades. I've met people in all different walks of life, business, education, law, medicine. I always find the great minds are the ones that can connect the dots, that can think outside their just we all have our little disciplinary niche, but the really interesting people, the leaders, the visionaries are the ones that can stand outside their particular training and make those connections. And I think that's what a liberal arts education at its best enables you to do.
Yeah.
So I'm actually optimistic about the power of the liberal arts in an increasingly technology based AI world.
I am too. I really am. I'm for the first time in a while, I'm feeling optimistic because I do think there is suddenly in our AI dominated world, which is every day
Mm.
changing swiftly, there is going to be an increased, I think, desire also for people in general to get back to um, the humanities, but also to being able to really solve as we grapple with these big problems that we're grappling with, to really try to find solutions requires
Yes,
kind of creative thinking, that kind of, again, connecting the dots, like you said, that I
yes.
do think the let's say the US model of a liberal arts education really does give students. And right now, I think this generation needs that more than ever. They're grappling with, we're all grappling with things that we probably would rather not be grappling with. And I think turning to the past also is something that can very much help us. And then we get back, of course, to your book. But I want to talk about something you do that I adore and that I want to thank you for, because what you do is you bring the humanities to a greater public. I want to talk about these incredible first of all, again, I don't know how you have time to do everything you do. You organize these spectacular events where you bring the humanities to a greater public.
Yeah.
I want to know a little bit about those. I want to know how they started, and also what kind of response do you have to them, because you do so many things from, the classics of, the great classics of, the Greek mythology to English, British literature from the 1800s to Dante. I mean, you do a lot. What prompted those? What inspired those?
So, I think the model of as people live longer, as they go into retirement, I think the model is changing. People I think people see retirement as a time of lifelong learning, and they want to
Yeah.
keep educating themselves, and they have the time, the resources to do so, and they want to be lifelong learners. And I'm a professor and a writer, but I'm also a lifelong learner. And there's things that I want to keep reading, things I want to keep teaching. And so I would say that a lot of the work that I'm doing now with the public is this belief that what an amazing way to spend your time, to read James Joyce's Ulysses closely, with someone who may not be a specialist in it, but is a professor of literature who knows the kind of questions to ask and can guide you through this extraordinary book, this difficult book. And it's been an amazing experience because I'm so inspired by people's willingness to tackle difficult books, to keep learning, and the energy. My home is the college classroom, and I work with the younger people that they're developing their minds, their education. But it's been amazing to see that there's a whole universe of people who want to keep learning and who are true believers in the power of literature, the power of great books, the power transformative powers of the humanities, and it builds community. I think that's been the most satisfying thing, is that you feel a real connection through the study of these great books, and whether it's or artists, call it what you will, film, and it's just a way, I think, to kind of put into action all these things we've been discussing. I mean, one of the problems with the defending the humanities is that the rhetoric sounds great. It's like, sure, like, think critically, contextualize, but what's that really mean? That really means getting together, rolling up your sleeves, looking at works of art, reading challenging books, watching thoughtful films, or whatever your field of domain happens to be. That's where it happens on the ground. And that's really where the interesting stuff is.
Yeah.
That the way to save the humanities is to just make them exciting and interesting for people. That's the best
Yeah.
defense. It's not going to be a learned treatise on why we need the humanities today. I mean, that is good in that you kind of articulate the principles behind what you're doing. But what it's really about is, boy, I loved that class I took in college 40
Yeah.
years ago when I read, Middlemarch for the first time. Wouldn't it be great to read Middlemarch again? I think, that's the humanities in action. The universities, I think, are, we're in a crossroads at the universities because we are, America, the United States still has many of the world's great universities. It draws people from all over the world, both our liberal arts colleges and our research universities. Um, the core of what we do, I think, is the classroom, and that space where a teacher brings something to life for the student and makes the magic of learning happen. It's that simple. It's
Yeah.
I say it's simple. It's hard because you have to get the student to have that experience, but that's what we need to build on. This natural love of desire to learn, which is such a Renaissance thing, right? I mean,
Yeah. We get
this
back to the start of this. Yeah.
to this humanist idea of pursuing knowledge and dedicating your life to it. And um, that, I think, is when universities are able to harness that, everything will fall into place. So a lot of what I'm doing, honestly, is just I'm lucky in that my job is my passion, what I love to do. I love to read, I love to write. It's why I decided to become a professor. I just get to do more of it. And there's so many people that are, when people talk about the crisis of the humanities, I actually think there's so many people who want to do it if we just find a way to bring them in. That's the challenge.
Yeah. I agree. And thank you for what you do, though, because it's an incredible way to engage people in these wonderful works. I always say youth is wasted on the young. If I could go back to college, I would go back in a heartbeat and, do everything that I didn't have time to do the first time around. We are at our last question. I
Sure.
can't believe it. But, so what's next for you, and what are you currently working on now that maybe you could give us a little sneak peek of? You're such a Renaissance man.
So I would say I'm always working on stuff, as you can imagine. I would say I have a short-term project and a long one.
Okay.
My short-term project is very related to my recent books on Botticelli, The Innocents of Florence. I'm writing a biography of Dante's muse, Beatrice.
Oh, I
So
love
we
that.
we don't
I'm
really
so
have
excited.
anything on her.
Yay.
And so the book will have two parts. The first half will be, my thesis is that the historical Beatrice matters, that as a scholar of Italian literature and Dante, and as a student of Florentine cultural history, I really believe, and we won't get into the weeds on this, but a lot of scholars see Beatrice as a symbol, as a muse. I actually think her historical life, as Santa Maria Nuova was dedicated to Florence by Beatrice's father, Folco Portinari.
Daddy,
So,
yeah.
you know, you sprain your ankle, you need an X-ray. You should thank Beatrice, right? The book will reconstruct her life, the first half, and there's very little physical evidence about her. And the
Mhm.
second half will chart the life and influence of Beatrice over the centuries on Petrarch's Laura, on Don Quixote's Dulcinea, on the pre-Raphaelite paintings, on James Joyce's muse figures, and all the way into pop culture. So that's the short-term project.
Wow.
Yeah. And the long-term goal, the long-term project, this is kind of brewing, is I really would like to write a book about the universities and higher education and the crossroads that we're at, and talking about some of these issues that we've touched on today, and how to kind of, you know, from my perspective as someone kind of in the trenches who's been teaching for
Yeah.
decades, how to reinvigorate and find a path forward for some of these crisis points in education that we're dealing with. But that's kind of brewing. That'll be after Beatrice. Right?
Okay. Well, these are incredible projects. I am so excited. I don't even know which one I'm more excited about, but I'm so happy you came on. I've loved this conversation. I wish I could be a student again at, in a classroom with you, and just this notion of, really being in constant evolution. We are lifelong learners. We need to go back a little to those principles of Renaissance humanism, and look at our whole selves, right? And this has been such a pleasure for me. I learned so much. I love talking to you. I cannot wait to read the books, and I am waiting for you in Florence. I have a copy of your book that needs to be signed, and
Oh, great.
we'll go to the Museo degli Innocenti, where there won't be any lines. They have a
That's
beautiful
right.
cafe,
That cafe on
gorgeous
the top
cafe,
is one of
right? Be-
Florence's hidden secrets,
yes.
really.
Well, now
Amazing.
everybody knows.
Yeah. Well, I'll look forward to that. Thank you. This has been a wonderful conversation, and I look forward to talking more down the road. Thanks so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Grazie mille.